I'd like to open up questions from the floor. Do we have Ernie Fazio from Limbo?
Almost everybody here probably knows that I've been an advocate for the maglev train, and it's a science that has the potential for creating 20 million jobs. We want to build major infrastructure,
Okay.
and we don't have the support of government like we did in the 50s. And we want to know if we can use public-private partnerships. What's the upside? What's the downside? And do you think it's feasible?
I know we probably have a lot of agreement here. I do think that the federal government should play an important role in infrastructure investment. I mean, we obviously have instances where the government is overreached, but in these cases, and it's particularly important for us here on Long Island, that infrastructure investment is critical. And sewage is a great example that you talked about. In Suffolk County, 70% of the sewage is treated through cesspools, which is an environmental issue. It's also a business issue. When you look at some of our downtowns that don't have sewer districts, they can't achieve that density until we get them. So I do think there's an important role with the federal government in making infrastructure investment. And as somebody who's a strong supporter of the private sector, that is something that infrastructure will have good consequences for the private sector. I think in terms of partnerships and what's happening at Brookhaven National Lab, and I know Congressman Bishop has been a big sponsor of it, using that technology they have at the lab, working together with private companies is a smart thing to do. We should be leveraging our national labs. My brother is a PhD in physics and worked at one at Lawrence Livermore, so I think those are great examples where the government is funding things that sometimes the private sector won't if it's pure research. Or if it's infrastructure, and then the private sector can piggyback off of that, and it can, in some instances, even become a profitable enterprise for the government.
Public-private partnerships has to be one of the tools in our toolbox if we are going to rebuild the infrastructure of this country and invest in the infrastructure to the extent that it's necessary. We've had several hearings in the T&I committee on public-private partnerships. I think there is fairly broad consensus across both sides of the aisle that this is one of the tools we need to pursue. They seem to be working in places where they have been put in place. Another piece of this, there is a piece of legislation in the Congress that I am a co-sponsor of that would lift the cap on what are referred to as private activity bonds that are used to invest in various infrastructure projects, such as highway projects, such as wastewater infrastructure projects. So I certainly support that. I will say that, again, that my fear is that the spirit of austerity that seems to suffuse the discussions in Washington right now is one that is going to be hurtful to investment in infrastructure, and private activity bonds and public-private partnerships are not going to be able to fill the gap if the government walks away. And I'll just give you an example. The budget resolution that passed the House of Representatives on a party line vote, Republicans voted for it, Democrats voted against it in the main, walks away from an investment in infrastructure. It cuts infrastructure investment over 10 years by $155 billion for highways, and it cuts infrastructure investment even more dramatically than that in terms of percentage, in terms of wastewater infrastructure and clean water infrastructure projects. So I think we have to find the right balance. The federal government needs to stay at the table, at least at the level we are at now, which I say is imperiled, and we have to pursue greater reliance on the funding mechanisms like public-private partnerships and private activity bonds.